Black people residing in what would become America staked their claim to be counted among patriots serving in all capacities to build a great nation. This is no place more striking as the evidence of military service documented in every war, as early as 1754 with the French and Indian War, and later the Revolutionary War, 1775. The first Rhode Island regiment, known by the names Varnum's Regiment, the 9th Continental Regiment, the Black Regiment, the Rhode Island Regiment, and Olney's Battalion, was a regiment in the Continental Army during the American Revolutionary War, fought from 1775 to 1783. The Black Regiment, 1778 to 1781. Blacks had been barred from military service in the Continental Army from 1775 until 1778, but Rhode Island was having difficulties recruiting enough white men to meet the troop quotas set by the Continental Congress in 1778, so the Rhode Island Assembly decided to pursue a suggestion made by General Varnum to enlist slaves in the 1st Rhode Island Regiment. Varnum had raised the idea in a letter to George Washington, who forwarded it to the governor of Rhode Island without explicitly approving or disapproving the plan. On February 14, 1778, the Rhode Island General Assembly voted to allow the enlistment of every able-bodied Negro, mulatto, or Indian man-slave who chose to do so, and voted that every slave so enlisting shall, upon his passing muster with Colonel Christopher Green, be immediately discharged from the service of his master or mistress, and be absolutely free. The owners of slaves who enlisted were to be compensated by the Assembly in an amount equal to their market value. The total of 88 slaves enlisted in the regiment over the next 4 months, as well as some free black men. The regiment eventually totaled about 225 men, probably fewer than 140 of these were black. The 1st Rhode Island became the only regiment of the Continental Army to have segregated companies of black soldiers. Other regiments had allowed black men to enlist but were integrated. The enlistment of slaves had been controversial, and no more non-white men were enlisted after June 1778. The unit continued to be known as the Black Regiment, even though only white men were recruited to replace losses, a process which eventually made it an integrated unit. We are well familiar with the legacy of Crispus Attucks, who, as a black and Native American stevedore, was rightly regarded as the first person killed in the Boston Massacre, and thus the first American killed in the American Revolution. But what of other blacks? Edward Ayers, an historian at the American Revolution Museum at Yorktown, wrote an article entitled African Americans and the American Revolution, stated that only 50 years after the defeat of the British at Yorktown, most Americans had already forgotten the extensive role black people had played on both sides during the War for Independence. He wrote that at the 1876 Continental Celebration of the Revolution in Philadelphia, not a single speaker acknowledged the contributions of African Americans in establishing the nation. Yet by 1783, thousands of black Americans had become involved in the war. Many were active participants, some won their freedom, and others were victims. But throughout the struggle, blacks refused to be mere bystanders and gave their loyalty to the side that seemed to offer the best prospect for their freedom. The article states that by 1775, more than 500,000 African Americans, most of them enslaved, were living in the 13 colonies. Early in the 18th century, a few New England ministers and conscientious Quakers such as George Keith and John Woolman had questioned the morality of slavery, but they were largely ignored. By the 1760s, however, as the colonists began to speak out against British tyranny, more Americans pointed out the obvious contradiction between advocating liberty and owning slaves. In 1774, First Lady Abigail Adams wrote, "It always appears a most iniquitous scheme to me to fight ourselves for what we are daily robbing and plundering from those who have as good a right to freedom as we have." Widespread talk of liberty gave thousands of slaves high expectations, and many were ready to fight for a democratic revolution that might offer them freedom. In 1775, at least 10 to 15 black soldiers, including some slaves, fought against the British at the Battle of Lexington and Bunker Hill. Two of these men, Salem Poor and Peter Salem, earned special distinction for their bravery. By 1776, however, it had become clear that the revolutionary rhetoric of the Founding Fathers did not include enslaved blacks. The Declaration of Independence promised liberty for all men, but failed to put an end to slavery, and although they had proved themselves in battle, the Continental Congress adopted a policy of excluding black soldiers from the army. In spite of these discouragements, many free and enslaved African Americans in New England were willing to take up arms against the British. As some states found it increasingly difficult to fill their enlistment quotas, they began to turn to their untapped pool of manpower. Eventually, every state above the Potomac River recruited slaves for military service, usually in exchange for their freedom. By the end of the war, from 5,000 to 8,000 blacks had served the American cause in some capacity, either on the battlefield, behind the lines in non-combatant roles, or on the seas. By 1777, some states began enacting laws that encouraged white owners to give slaves for the army in return for their enlistment bounty, or allowing masters to use slaves as substitutes when they or their sons were drafted. In the South, the idea of arming slaves for military service met with such opposition that only free blacks were normally allowed to enlist in the army. Most black soldiers were scattered throughout the Continental Army in integrated infantry regiments, where they were often assigned to support roles as wagoners, cooks, waiters, and artisans. Several all-black units, commanded by white officers, also were formed and saw action against the British. Rhode Island's Black Battalion was established in 1778, when that state was unable to meet its quota for the Continental Army. The legislature agreed to set free slaves who volunteered for the duration of the war and compensated their owners for their value. This regiment performed bravely throughout the war and was present at Yorktown, where an observer noted that it was, quote, "the most neatly dressed, the best under arms, and the most precise in its maneuvers," end quote. Although the Southern states were reluctant to recruit enslaved African Americans for the army, they had no objection to using free and enslaved blacks as pilots and able-bodied seamen. In Virginia alone, as many as 150 black men, many of them slaves, served in the state navy. After the war, the legislature granted several of these men their freedom as a reward for faithful service. African Americans also served as gunners, sailors on privateers, and in the Continental Navy during the Revolution. While the majority of blacks who contributed to the struggle for independence performed routine duties, a few, such as James Lafayette, gained renown serving as spies or orderlies for well-known military leaders. Black participation in the Revolution, however, was not limited to supporting the American cause, and either voluntarily or under duress, thousands also fought for the British. Enslaved blacks made their own assessment of the conflict and supported the side that offered the best opportunity to escape bondage. Most British officials were reluctant to arm blacks, but as early as 1775, Virginia's royal governor, Lord Dunmore, established an all-black Ethiopian regiment composed of runaway slaves. By promising them freedom, Dunmore enticed over 800 slaves to escape from rebel masters. Whenever they could, enslaved blacks continued to join him until he was defeated and forced to leave Virginia in 1776. Dunmore's innovative strategy met with disfavor in England, but to many blacks the British Army came to represent liberation. Now, the fate of black loyalists. On July 21, 1781, as the final British ship left Savannah, more than 5,000 enslaved African Americans were transported with their loyalist masters for Jamaica or St. Augustine. About 300 blacks in Savannah did not evacuate, fearing that they would be re-enslaved. They established a colony in the swamps of the Savannah River. By 1786, many were back in bondage. The British evacuation of Charleston in December 1782 included many loyalists and more than 5,000 blacks. More than half of these were slaves held by the loyalists. They were taken by their masters for resettlement in the West Indies, where the loyalists started or bought plantations. The British also settled freed slaves in Jamaica and other West Indian islands, eventually granting them land. Another 500 slaves were taken to East Florida, which remained under British control. The British promised freedom to slaves who left rebels to side with the British. In New York City, which the British occupied, thousands of refugee slaves had migrated there to gain freedom. The British created a registry of escaped slaves called the Book of Negroes. The registry included details of their enslavement, escape, and service to the British. If accepted, the former slave received a certificate entitling transport out of New York. By the time the Book of Negroes was closed, it had the names of 1,336 men, 914 women, and 750 children who were resettled in Nova Scotia. They were known in Canada as Black Loyalists. 65% of those evacuated were from the South. About 200 former slaves were taken to London, with British forces as free people. After the war, many freed blacks living in London and Nova Scotia struggled with discrimination, a slow pace of land grants, and in Canada with the more severe climate. Supporters in England organized and established a colony in West Africa for the resettlement of poor blacks of London, most of whom were former American slaves. Freetown was the first settlement established of what became the colony of Sierra Leone. Black loyalists in Nova Scotia were also asked if they wanted to relocate. Many chose to go to Africa, and on January 15, 1792, 1,193 blacks left Halifax for West Africa and a new life. Later, the African colony was supplemented by Afro-Caribbean Maroons transported by the British from Jamaica, as well as Africans who were liberated by the British in their intervention in the Atlantic slave trade, after Britain prohibited it in 1807. The African American patriots who served the Continental Army found that the post-war military held no rewards for them. It was much reduced in size, and state legislatures such as Connecticut and Massachusetts in 1784 and 1785 respectively banned all blacks, free or slave, from military service. Southern states also banned all slaves from their militia. In 1792, the United States Congress formally excluded African Americans from military service, allowing only free, able-bodied white male citizens to serve.